Ida for rolling my eyes at my ex's wife when she asked me for compassion? When I first met my ex's new wife, I wasn't expecting hostility. We had managed to keep things amicable between us, balancing our co-parenting responsibilities with mutual respect, ensuring our boys had stability. There had never been drama, no fiery arguments, no bitterness. Just two people who outgrew their relationship but remained committed to their children. But the moment she entered the picture, it was like a storm cloud settled over everything we had built. I remember the exact moment we met. She had been polite on the surface, but there was a glint in her eye, something assessing, something cold. The smile she gave me was forced, the kind that never reaches the eyes, the kind that only exists out of obligation. She didn't introduce herself by name. Instead, she smiled and said, "Oh, so you're the kid's other mom," her tone dripping with possession, as if she were establishing dominance. Her words struck me like a slap. Other mom? The implication was clear. She was the mom, and I was secondary. Lesser. An afterthought. My response was automatic, firm, unwavering. No, I'm not the other mom. I'm their mother. That moment set the tone for everything that followed. From then on, she took every opportunity to assert herself, as if proving something to me, to herself, to the world. She started referring to them as her boys whenever she spoke to me, her voice deliberately casual but her gaze sharp, challenging. "You know, as a boy mom, I really understand what they need," she would say, her words carefully crafted to diminish my role in their lives. It was more than just words, it was the way she said them, like she was carving out a space for herself while chiseling away at mine. Then came the control. She didn't just want to be part of their lives, she wanted to take over. She tried to filter everything through her, making herself the gatekeeper of my own children. One day, she simply declared that all communication about the boys had to go through her, not my ex. As if she had the authority to decide. As if she was the final decision maker. When I refused, she was indignant, practically seething with barely restrained fury. "You don't have the right," she hissed at me, as if I was an interloper in my own children's lives. That was the first real battle. But it was only the beginning. Her next move was subtle but insidious. She began sending me updates about their time together. It started small, 1 or 2 photos of my boys playing at the park or eating ice cream with her and my ex. At first, I told myself it was just a courtesy, an attempt to include me. But the messages kept coming, growing in frequency, in intensity, in meaning. She would send 3, 4, 5 pictures in a row, each one paired with a message carefully worded to reinforce her place in their lives. "We had such a wonderful day with our boys. Spending time with my children is the highlight of my life. Family is everything." I could feel the calculated intent behind every word. It wasn't just about keeping me informed, it was about making a statement. A warning. A declaration that she was there to stay and that I was the one who needed to adjust. It was always the same message, packaged in different ways. She was the mother now. She was the one who mattered. And I was being slowly, deliberately erased. I started saving every single message, every single photo. Not because I wanted to hold on to the memories she was trying to manufacture, but because I didn't trust her. Something about the way she was inserting herself into my children's lives, the way she was pushing boundaries, felt dangerous. It wasn't love, it was possession. It was about winning, about taking something that wasn't hers to claim. When I tried talking to my ex about it, I was met with indifference, with excuses, with dismissiveness. "She's just trying to be a good stepmom," he told me, as if that justified everything. "She's putting in a lot of effort." When I pointed out how she spoke to me, how she tried to edge me out, how she was rewriting reality to suit her own desires, he simply sighed. "She's insecure," he said, as if that made it okay. As if I was supposed to absorb her insecurities, let her diminish me, let her rewrite my children's lives so she could feel better about her place in them. And while we sat there talking, my phone buzzed with yet another message from her. You really shouldn't discuss our children with my husband without including me, it read. Our children. My husband. It was all there, woven into a single text. The claim. The possessiveness. The rewriting of reality. I showed my ex the message. He barely reacted. She's just feeling threatened, he repeated, as if I should be the bigger person, as if I should just let it go. But this wasn't about insecurity. This was about control. And I wasn't going to let her take mine. I sat across from my ex, my patience stretched thin, his words ringing in my ears. She's just trying to be a good stepmom. He said it as if that justified everything, as if it was my responsibility to accommodate her attempts, no matter how invasive, no matter how dismissive of my role. As if I should step aside and let her rewrite the story of our children's lives just because she wanted to. I clenched my jaw, inhaling deeply. Trying to be a good stepmom doesn't mean she gets to erase me, I said, my voice steady, controlled, but laced with frustration. It doesn't mean she gets to act like I don't exist, like I'm just some obstacle in the way of the fantasy she's trying to build. He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face, the way he always did when he didn't want to deal with something. She's insecure, he repeated, as if that was some kind of magic spell that made everything acceptable. You're the bigger person here. You should understand that. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Understand that? Understand what, exactly? That I was supposed to shrink myself down, make myself smaller, so she could feel more comfortable? That I was supposed to hand over my motherhood like it was something that could be transferred, borrowed, rewritten? And then, as if the universe wanted to drive the point home, my phone vibrated on the table between us. Another text from her. Another intrusion. You have no right to discuss my children with my husband without including me. I pushed my phone across the table, letting him read it. His eyes flicked across the screen, his expression unreadable. Then, with a tired exhale, he handed it back. She's just insecure, he repeated, softer this time, as if even he knew how weak it sounded. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't going to get better. This wasn't going to settle. There was no reasoning with her, no finding a middle ground. She wasn't interested in co-parenting, she was interested in replacing me. And my ex, whether out of guilt, out of exhaustion, or out of sheer blindness, was going to let it happen. And so, the battle lines were drawn. It started with small things, subtle acts of control, tiny power grabs she likely thought I wouldn't notice. She tried to have her family added to the school pickup list, as if she could extend her influence through them. When that failed, she pushed to be able to make medical decisions, arguing that she should be allowed to take the boys to doctor's appointments, that she should be able to change their pediatrician without my approval. Each time, I pushed back. Each time, she ceded. My ex never fought me on those decisions, not really. He never pushed for his wife's access the way she did. He didn't have the energy for a real fight. But she did. And every time she hit a roadblock, every time I reminded her that she wasn't their mother, her resentment grew. I saw it in the way she glared at me during parent-teacher conferences, her face carefully composed but her jaw tight, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles turned white. I saw it in the way she inserted herself into my son's medical appointments, introducing herself as their mother in front of doctors and specialists, her voice firm, unyielding, as if sheer force of will could make it true. And the worst part? My ex just stood there and let it happen. We ended up in court twice over this. The first time, I came armed with documentation, texts, emails, records of every attempt she had made to override me, to push me out. I sat in that courtroom, my heart pounding as my lawyer laid it all out, as the judge listened with a sharp, discerning gaze. My ex's wife sat stiffly beside him, her expression carefully blank, but I could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers tapped against her knee. And then, when it was her turn to speak, she did something that almost made me laugh out loud. She tried to paint me as the villain. "She's alienating them from me," she said, her voice full of forced emotion. "I've been in their lives for years. They were so young when I became their mother, but she's made sure they don't see me that way." I blinked. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. But then I saw the way her lips pressed together, the way she lifted her chin slightly, as if daring me to challenge her. The judge, to his credit, remained unimpressed. "You claim that children see you as their mother," he said, his tone flat. "Do you have any proof that they've ever referred to you that way?" Her mouth opened, then closed. Silence. The judge's gaze didn't waver. "That is not proof of alienation." And just like that, the first ruling was made. She was not their mother. She was not allowed to impersonate me in school or medical settings. The judge made it very clear that any attempt to alienate me from my own children would not be tolerated. But did that stop her? No. It only made her bolder. The second time we were dragged back to court, it was worse. This time, I had evidence, an incident documented by school staff. She had introduced herself as the boy's real mother. In front of them. In front of teachers. In front of an entire room of people who knew better. The judge's patience had run out. This time, the restrictions were harsher. She was barred from drop-offs. Barred from attending appointments or meetings that required both parents. The ruling was clear. She was not their mother. I watched her face as the judge spoke. Her mask cracked. For the first time since this all began, I saw real anger in her eyes, not just frustration, not just irritation, but something deeper, something raw. She was furious. Not because she loved my children. Not because she cared about them in the way a mother should. But because she had lost. Because she hadn't been able to take what wasn't hers. And as I walked out of that courtroom, my ex trailing behind me, I felt something settle in my chest, something like relief. It wasn't over. It would never truly be over with someone like her. But at least, for now, she had been stopped. The court's decision had left her fuming, but at least it had one silver lining: her constant interference in my life became significantly less frequent. The endless texts, the passive-aggressive photo updates, the attempts to wedge herself between me and my children all but disappeared overnight. I didn't fool myself into believing she had given up entirely, but for the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like someone was trying to suffocate me in my own role as a mother. I turned my focus where it belonged, on my boys. They were growing fast, and the last thing they needed was to be caught in the crossfire of someone else's desperate need to rewrite reality. Parenting with my ex was no longer smooth, but it was manageable. We exchanged information about the kids. We coordinated schedules. It was strained but functional. And that was enough for me. But even with her silence, a storm was brewing in their household, and eventually, it made its way to my doorstep. It started with a phone call from my ex, an unexpected one, his voice oddly subdued, lacking the usual frustration or passive defense of his wife's behavior. "They don't like her," he admitted, his words heavy with something close to exhaustion. "The boys. They don't like her." I had known this already, of course. My children weren't the type to be outright cruel, but their discomfort around her had always been obvious. They were polite, but stiff. They tolerated, but never warmed to her. They never referred to her as mom, never sought her out for comfort, never treated her the way a child naturally treats someone they love. But hearing my ex admit it, that was something new. "They've been saying it to me more lately," he continued, clearing his throat like the words were difficult to say. "And I think it's getting to her." That, too, I already knew. She had spent years trying to claim them, convinced that time and persistence would eventually bend reality to her will. But time had done nothing but solidify the truth: she was not their mother, and they were not hers. They still see their therapist, right? He asked, hesitating slightly. Would you be okay if they did family therapy? Just to see if it helps. I agreed. Not because I wanted to help her, but because I wanted to make sure my kids had a safe place to talk about their feelings. If they had things they needed to say, things they were afraid to express at home, I wanted them to have an outlet. But I didn't have high hopes that it would change anything. And I was right. Weeks passed, and if anything, the distance between my boys and her grew even wider. It wasn't dramatic. They didn't scream at her or openly reject her. It was in the little things: the way they pulled away from her touch, the way they avoided sitting next to her, the way they answered her questions with short, clipped words. It was the way they chose to talk to their father instead of her, the way they stopped acknowledging her presence in a way that must have cut her deeper than any tantrum or shouting match ever could. It wasn't hate. It wasn't even spite. It was indifference. And indifference can be so much worse. I learned later that during therapy, the boys had been honest, brutally so. They didn't see her as their mother. They didn't want to see her as their mother. She was just their dad's wife, someone who had been in their lives for years but had never truly been a part of them. And, worst of all, they admitted they didn't trust her. They knew what she had tried to do. They remembered the things she had said, the way she had introduced herself as their real mother, the way she had tried to control aspects of their lives that she had no right to. Kids might not always say much in the moment, but they see. They understand. And they had understood, even at a young age, that she had been trying to replace me. That she had seen them as pawns in some desperate bid to fill the void inside her. And now? Now, they simply wanted nothing to do with her. I didn't think much of it when I heard a knock at my door late one evening. My ex sometimes dropped things off for the boys, and occasionally, my neighbors stopped by with misdelivered mail. But when I opened the door, it wasn't my ex. It was her. She stood there, looking smaller than I had ever seen her before. There was no smugness, no forced confidence, no barely concealed hostility. She looked defeated. Before I could say anything, she started talking. The words spilled out of her in a rapid, chaotic mess. She told me about the therapy sessions, about how the boys had said they didn't trust her, about how they had made it clear that no matter what she did, they would never see her as their mother. And then, the real reason she was here. She couldn't have biological children. They had tried everything. Tests. Treatments. Procedures. And the final verdict had been clear: she would never carry a child of her own. And then, to make it worse, they had tried to adopt. They had been rejected. Twice. She stood there, unloading every bit of her grief onto me like I was supposed to do something with it. Like I was supposed to have an answer, a solution, a shred of sympathy. And when she finally reached the end of her breathless confession, she looked at me, eyes hollow, voice trembling. "You're a mother," she whispered. "You understand what it's like to need them. To need that love." And then, the final blow. "Please. Please help me fix this." I stared at her, barely holding back the urge to laugh in sheer disbelief. She had spent years trying to erase me. Trying to take my place. Trying to paint a version of reality where I was the outsider, and she was the rightful mother. And now, when it all crumbled around her, when reality refused to bend the way she wanted it to, now she wanted my help. She wanted my compassion. I couldn't stop it. The eye roll happened before I even realized it. And she saw. Her face twisted, her lips curling into a sneer, her shoulders tensing like a coiled spring. Whatever vulnerability had been there a moment ago vanished, replaced by raw, seething resentment. She spat something at me, something I didn't even bother to register, and stormed off. That night, she sent me 10 texts, each angrier than the last. The next morning, my ex called me. "You owe her an apology," he said. And for the first time in a long time, I laughed. I didn't respond to my ex's demand for an apology right away. Instead, I let the words sit there, buzzing in my head like an irritating mosquito I refused to swat. An apology? For what? For not indulging his wife's theatrics? For not playing along with the fantasy she had built in her head for years? For not pretending to feel something I didn't? I wasn't cruel to her. I hadn't screamed or insulted her. I hadn't thrown her grief back in her face. I had simply reacted the way any sane person would after being expected to extend endless patience to someone who had spent years trying to erase them. But the audacity of it all, the entitlement gnawed at me. I ignored his message that night, turned off my phone, and focused on my kids. We had dinner together, they told me about their day, and we settled into our normal, quiet evening routine. It was peaceful. It was everything I wanted for them. And then morning came. The first thing I saw when I checked my phone was yet another message from my ex. "Ignoring this doesn't make it go away. You were out of line. She's struggling. You could have at least been civil." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Civil. He wanted me to be civil. After everything. I tapped out a response, kept it short. "I don't owe her anything." A few minutes passed, and then my phone lit up with his reply. "You could at least try to be a decent person." That was the moment something inside me snapped. I had spent years being the bigger person. Years biting my tongue, choosing my battles, letting things slide for the sake of peace. I had tolerated her smug little comments, her boundary pushing, her repeated attempts to shove me into the background of my own children's lives. And still, it had never been enough. Still, I was the villain in their story. So I decided to set the record straight. A decent person? A decent person wouldn't have spent years trying to erase me. A decent person wouldn't have called my children hers while actively trying to push me out of their lives. A decent person wouldn't have tried to take parental rights that weren't hers. You married her, not me. Her problems are not my problems. And I will not be guilt-tripped into caring about a woman who never once cared about me. I sent the message, shut off my phone, and went about my day. He didn't reply. Not that day. Not the next. And for a while, I thought maybe, just maybe, that was the end of it. That maybe, finally, after all this time, they had realized they couldn't manipulate me into giving them what they wanted. But of course, it wasn't over. Because people like her never let things be over. 2 weeks passed without a word. Then, out of nowhere, a message. Not from my ex. From her. "I just want to talk. Please. No drama, no fighting. Just a conversation." I stared at it for a long time, debating. My first instinct was to ignore her. But a part of me, a tiny part, was curious. What could she possibly have to say now? So I responded. "About what?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Can we meet? In person? Just us." That set off every alarm bell in my head. I wasn't stupid. I knew this wasn't about closure or reconciliation. This was about control. I had stripped away the last of her illusions, and now she was scrambling, desperate to find some new angle, some new way to insert herself into my life and force me to play a role I had no interest in playing. No. That was all I sent. And the floodgates opened. She unraveled in real time, message after message pouring in. "You're heartless. You enjoy this, don't you? Watching me suffer. You could have had some empathy. You could have helped. We could have been on the same side." The same side? There had never been sides. There was only me, fighting to keep my place as my children's mother, and her, trying to rewrite history to suit her needs. I blocked her number. And then, for good measure, I sent my ex a final message. Your wife has been harassing me for years. It ends now. If she contacts me again, I will take legal action. This is my final warning. He never responded. But she never contacted me again. Time moved on. The boys got older. They thrived. They laughed. They learned. They became their own people. They continued therapy, but they never grew closer to her. And eventually, it didn't matter anymore. Because one day, she was just gone. I don't know what finally broke her, whether it was the realization that she would never be their mother, or the slow, crushing weight of a marriage that had been built on something unsustainable. But one day, she and my ex split. The boys barely reacted to the news. My ex told me in a clipped, emotionless voice that she had moved out, and I nodded, offering nothing. And life continued. The world didn't end. The sky didn't fall. She had spent years trying to carve a place for herself in a role that wasn't hers. And when that didn't work, she had tried to force me out. But in the end, she was the one who disappeared.